The early morning sunlight painted the fields of Willow Creek in hues of gold and amber. Dew clung to the tall blades of grass, glistening like tiny jewels. Clarence Grayson, 92 years old and still spry for his age, sat on the creaking wooden chair on his porch, nursing a steaming mug of black coffee. He had always been an early riser, a habit forged during his days in the army, where dawn signaled the start of another mission. His farmhouse stood in quiet defiance of time. Its paint was peeling, and the roof bore the scars of many storms, but it was home. Every plank and nail held memories, the laughter of his children echoing through the halls, the scent of Eleanor's Sunday roasts wafting from the kitchen, and the nights he spent sitting on this very porch, marveling at the stars with her by his side. Those days were long gone, but the memories lingered, keeping him company in the stillness of his twilight years. Clarence's gaze drifted to the fields he had cultivated for decades. The soil was rich, the crops healthy, and though his hands had lost their strength, he still oversaw the work with the help of hired hands from the town. The farm was his legacy, a piece of himself he hoped to leave behind. A crow landed on the porch railing, its beady eyes fixed on Clarence. "Morning, friend," he murmured, tipping his hat to the bird. It cawed in response, flapping its wings before taking off. Clarence chuckled softly. "Even you've got somewhere to be." The quiet was comforting, but it carried an underlying tension, like the stillness before a storm. Clarence didn't know why, but he felt a weight in the air, a sense that something was coming. The distant rumble of engines shattered the calm. At first he thought it was a tractor on a neighboring farm, but the sound grew louder, closer, and more aggressive. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a group of motorcycles speeding down the dirt road leading to his property. 6 of them, their riders clad in leather jackets adorned with menacing insignias. The Steel Vipers, Clarence had heard of them, a motorcycle gang that had been stirring up trouble in Willow Creek for months, stealing, vandalizing, and intimidating anyone who crossed their path. The sheriff's office, understaffed and overwhelmed, had done little to rein them in. He set his coffee cup down, his weathered hands tightening into fists. The last thing he wanted was trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had found him. The motorcycle screeched to a halt at the edge of his driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted toward the porch. Clarence stood, leaning on his cane, and stepped to the edge of the porch. His tall frame, though hunched by age, still carried a quiet authority. He watched the riders dismount, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a thick beard, smirked as he looked Clarence up and down. "Nice place you got here, old-timer," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Clarence didn't reply. He simply stared, his steely blue eyes locking onto the leader's. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Another rider jeered, earning a round of laughter from the group. Clarence finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "If you're lost, the main road's back that way." The leader's smirk widened into a grin. "Oh, we're not lost. Heard a lot about this farm of yours. Thought we'd come check it out. Looks like you've got plenty of room, and plenty we could use." Clarence's jaw tightened. "This farm's not for sale." "Who said anything about buying?" The leader shot back, his grin turning into a sneer. The other riders laughed, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. Clarence held his ground, his heart pounding. He had faced enemies before, men far more dangerous than these, but it had been a long time since he'd felt the need to defend himself. The leader stepped closer, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust as he closed the gap. "Let me make this simple," the man said, his tone growing menacing. "We're gonna set up here for a while. You won't even notice us. But if you got a problem with that, well, let's just say problems have a way of taking care of themselves." Clarence didn't blink. "You've got no business here. I'm asking you to leave." The leader's grin faded, replaced by a hard, dangerous glare. The 2 men stood in silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The gang began to shift uneasily, their bravado tempered by the quiet strength radiating from the old man. Finally, the leader chuckled, breaking the silence. "All right, Grandpa, We'll leave. For now. But don't think this is over. With that, he turned and signaled to his gang. They mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life, and sped off down the road, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Clarence stood there watching until the sound of their engines faded into the distance. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with anger. He knew they'd be back. Bullies like that always came back. He turned and walked back into the house, shutting the door behind him. In the quiet that followed, Clarence opened a small wooden chest in the corner of the living room. Inside lay an old, well-maintained service pistol, its grip worn smooth by decades of use. He picked it up, the weight of it familiar in his hand. Clarence sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts racing. He hadn't fought a battle in over 70 years, but if it came to it, he was ready. The storm was coming, and Clarence Grayson wasn't about to be swept away. Clarence stood on the edge of his porch, a lone figure against the rising sun. The creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet was the only sound as he stared down the intruders. The steel vipers dismounted their motorcycles, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators circling prey. The leader swaggered forward, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The man's scarred face twisted into a smirk as he looked Clarence up and down. "Well, look at this," he drawled, spreading his arms like he owned the place. "Didn't expect to find a war hero guarding a pile of dirt." Clarence didn't respond, his gaze locked on the man. The wind tugged at his shirt, but he stood as solid as the oak tree in his yard. He'd seen men like this before, swaggering, overconfident, drunk on their own sense of power. The leader stopped a few feet away, close enough for Clarence to smell the faint tang of motor oil and cigarette smoke clinging to his leather jacket. "Name's Axel," he said, gesturing to the others behind him. "This here's my crew. We like to keep an eye on little towns like this, make sure everyone's comfortable." "Comfortable?" Clarence's voice was calm, his tone razor-sharp. "Yeah," Axel said, grinning. "See, there's a lot of bad stuff out there. Fires, thefts, accidents. Wouldn't want any of that happening to a nice place like this. We're here to keep that from happening." Clarence's jaw tightened. "You mean extortion?" Axel's grin faltered for a split second before he threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing across the empty fields. "Call it whatever you want, Grandpa. We call it insurance." The gang chuckled behind him, their laughter a low, menacing rumble. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, spat on the ground. "Place like this ain't worth much anyway," he sneered. Axel turned back to Clarence, his expression hardening. "Here's how it's gonna work. You let us stay here for a bit. Couple of weeks, tops. We'll keep to ourselves, won't even touch your precious crops. In return, you pay us, let's say, a little fee. Call it a neighborly gesture." "And if I say no?" Clarence asked, his voice as steady as his gaze. Axel stepped closer, his smirk returning. "Then you'll find out how quickly this nice little house of yours can turn into a pile of ashes." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Clarence and Axel stared each other down. Finally, Clarence spoke, his tone colder than the morning air. "You boys have 10 seconds to get off my property." Axel's grin vanished, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You really want to do this the hard way, old man?" 7 seconds, Clarence said, ignoring the question. The gang began shifting uneasily, glancing at each other. They weren't used to this. Most people cowered, begged, or handed over whatever was asked. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Axel's jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near the chain hanging from his belt. "You're making a mistake." 3 seconds. The finality in Clarence's voice made even Axel hesitate. For a moment, the gang leader seemed to weigh his options, his eyes flicking to the pistol holstered on Clarence's hip. Finally, he spat on the ground and threw up his hands. "Fine. We'll go. For now. But don't think this is over, old man." Axel turned on his heel and motioned to his crew. Reluctantly, the gang mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Clarence didn't move, didn't flinch as they peeled out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As the last motorcycle disappeared down the road, Clarence finally allowed himself to exhale. His heart was pounding, but his expression remained unreadable. He turned and walked back inside, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Inside the house, Clarence stood by the window, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He watched the horizon, knowing they'd be back. Men like Axel didn't take no for an answer. But neither did Clarence Grayson. The house was quiet now, the lingering echo of the motorcycles fading into the stillness of the farm. Clarence sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, his calloused hands resting on its worn surface. The light streaming through the window caught the deep lines etched into his face, each one a testament to years of toil, loss, and perseverance. On the table before him lay an object that carried its own history, a Colt M 1911 pistol, its steel worn smooth by time and use. Clarence stared at it, his mind drifting to a place he rarely visited. The farm faded from his vision, replaced by the memory of another time, another battlefield. He could almost hear the distant gunfire, feel the damp chill of the Normandy beaches, and smell the acrid smoke of war. It had been 79 years since that fateful day, yet the images were as sharp as if they had happened yesterday. Clarence was barely out of his teens when he found himself in the thick of World War II, a scared but determined soldier among thousands. He remembered the chaos of D-Day, the roar of the planes overhead, the deafening blasts of artillery, and the gut-wrenching screams of his comrades. But what stayed with him most was the feeling that he couldn't afford to falter, no matter the odds. "You're the lucky one," a voice had told him back then. It belonged to Sergeant Donnelly, his squad leader. They were crouched behind a crumbling stone wall pinned down by enemy fire. Donnelly's face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes burned with determination. "You're still breathing. That means you fight." Clarence had taken those words to heart. Through every skirmish, every sleepless night in a cold foxhole, and every moment he thought he wouldn't survive, he kept fighting. When the war ended and the world began to heal, he returned to Willow Creek with scars no one could see. But he had survived, and he'd carried the lesson with him. Resolve is a soldier's greatest weapon. Now, sitting in his kitchen decades later, Clarence ran his fingers over the pistol's grip. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of that resolve. He'd carried it through hell and back, and though he hadn't fired it in years, it still felt like an extension of himself. He glanced toward the window, his gaze fixed on the dirt road where the gang had vanished. He knew they weren't done with him. Bullies like them never were. They'd tasted his defiance, and they'd come back, angrier and more determined to break him. But Clarence wasn't the same man they'd terrorized before. As the memories of war swirled in his mind, he felt the weight of a responsibility he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about his farm. It was about standing up to the kind of tyranny he thought he'd left behind on foreign shores. His eyes drifted to a faded photograph hanging on the wall. It showed him as a young man in uniform, standing beside a grinning Eleanor on their wedding day. She had always been his anchor, the reason he fought so hard to build a life worth living after the war. Losing her had been the hardest battle of all, but her memory gave him strength even now. Clarence stood, his knees creaking with the effort. He walked over to a wooden chest tucked into the corner of the room. Inside were remnants of a life lived fully, a folded American flag, his army medals, and an old helmet dented from shrapnel. He reached past them and pulled out a weathered ammunition box, its latch stiff with age. Carrying the box to the table, he opened it and began to inspect the rounds inside. His hands were slower now, his grip less steady, but he moved with purpose. Each click of a magazine being loaded echoed like a drum beat in the quiet room. "You're still breathing," Clarence murmured to himself, echoing Sergeant Donnelly's words. "That means you fight." Once the pistol was loaded, he holstered it on his hip and grabbed a lantern from the counter. He stepped out onto the porch, the wooden planks groaning beneath his weight. The air was colder now, the sun sinking lower in the sky. He could feel the storm brewing, not in the weather but in the pit of his gut. Clarence's gaze swept across the fields, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The steel vipers had underestimated him, and that was their mistake. They saw an old man, a relic of a forgotten time, but they didn't see the soldier who had endured the unthinkable. He wasn't just defending a farm, he was defending everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, and if they came back, he'd remind them what resolve looked like. Clarence leaned against the porch railing, his grip tightening on the lantern. The shadows stretched long across the fields, but he stood tall, ready for whatever came next. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The night descended like a shroud over the farmhouse. The moon hung low, its pale light casting jagged shadows across the fields. Inside, Clarence sat in his living room, the lantern dimmed to a faint glow. His service pistol rested on the table beside him, within easy reach. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the old house felt louder than it should. Then he heard it. The low, guttural rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance growing louder with every passing second. Clarence's breath hitched, but his resolve didn't waver. He rose from his chair, his movements slow but deliberate. He knew this moment was coming. The steel vipers were back. From the window, Clarence watched as the gang's headlights pierced the darkness, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust as they roared onto his property. This time there were more of them, at least 10 riders, their silhouettes menacing in the glow of their headlights. They lined up in the driveway like a pack of wolves, their engines snarling in unison. The leader, Axel, stepped off his bike first, his scarred face twisted into a grin. He pulled a length of chain from his belt, letting it drag across the ground as he walked toward the house. The other riders followed, some carrying tire irons, others brandishing knives and bats. "Gramps," Axel called out, his voice booming. "We're back, and this time we're not asking nicely." Clarence didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the chest in the corner of the room and pulled out an old double-barreled shotgun. It hadn't seen action in years, but like his pistol, it was still well maintained. He checked the shells, snapping the barrel shut with a satisfying click. The gang began surrounding the house, their voices loud and mocking. "Come on out, old man," one of them shouted. "We'll go easy on you." Axel's voice cut through the chatter. "If you don't come out, we'll make this place light up like a bonfire." Clarence moved to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't afraid of these men, but he wasn't foolish enough to underestimate them either. They were younger, stronger, and outnumbered him, but he had the advantage of knowing the terrain and the will to fight. With a deep breath, Clarence stepped onto the porch, the shotgun resting in his hands. His figure, silhouetted against the warm glow of the lantern inside, was enough to make the gang pause. Even Axel hesitated for a moment before his grin returned. "Well, look who's got some fight in him after all," Axel said, twirling the chain in lazy circles. "You really think that antique is going to stop us?" Clarence's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who had faced worse than Axel could imagine. "You've got one chance to leave. Take it." The gang erupted in laughter, their voices echoing into the night. Axel took a step closer, pointing his chain at Clarence. "That's the thing, old man. We don't take orders, we give them." The sound of glass shattering cut through the laughter as one of the gang members threw a brick through the front window. Clarence's grip tightened on the shotgun, but he held his ground. "You're making a mistake," Clarence said, his voice low but firm. Axel sneered. "No, you made the mistake when you said no." With a sharp whistle, Axel gave the signal, and the gang began advancing on the house. Some stayed by their bikes, revving their engines as a show of intimidation, while others moved toward the porch, weapons in hand. Clarence raised the shotgun. He fired a warning shot into the air, the deafening boom cutting through the night like thunder. The gang froze, their bravado faltering. "Next one won't miss," Clarence growled. Axel scowled but didn't back down. "You really think you can take all of us?" he asked, his tone mocking but edged with uncertainty. Clarence's lips curled into a thin smile. "I've taken worse." The gang surged forward, emboldened by their numbers, but Clarence had been preparing for this moment. As one of the riders tried to climb onto the porch, Clarence swung the shotgun like a club, knocking the man back with a sickening thud. Another lunged at him with a bat, but Clarence sidestepped and delivered a blow to the man's ribs with the butt of the shotgun. Inside the house, Clarence had set up a few surprises. As the gang tried to break down the back door, they triggered a tripwire that sent a stack of heavy tools crashing down, scattering them in panic. Another trap, a bundle of fireworks rigged to a motion sensor, erupted in a burst of blinding light and deafening noise, sending the attackers scrambling. Axel, furious, charged toward the porch with his chain raised. "You're gonna pay for that, you old fool," he roared. Clarence leveled the shotgun at Axel, his finger steady on the trigger. "Don't take another step," he warned. Axel hesitated, his bravado slipping. But before he could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the chaos. Flashing red and blue lights appeared at the edge of the driveway, and the gang froze. The sheriff and his deputies poured onto the property, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground," the sheriff bellowed. Axel snarled but knew he was out of options. One by one, the gang complied, their weapons clattering to the ground. The deputies moved quickly, cuffing the riders and hauling them away. Clarence lowered the shotgun, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The sheriff approached, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You all right, Clarence?" he asked. Clarence nodded, his gaze still fixed on Axel as the gang leader was dragged toward a patrol car. "I'm fine." Axel glared at him, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over, old man," he spat. Clarence didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back into the house, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the lantern. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving the chaos of the night to fade into the quiet of his home. The Steel Vipers weren't the kind of men who took defeat lightly. As the patrol cars disappeared into the night, Axel sat in the back seat, his wrists cuffed, his eyes burning with fury. He knew small-town sheriffs didn't have the resources to keep him locked up for long, and he wasn't going to let some relic of a man like Clarence Grayson embarrass him in front of his crew. "This isn't over," Axel muttered under his breath. He didn't have to say it twice. His crew, though battered and humiliated, shared his hunger for revenge. Plans began forming even before the cell door slammed behind them. 2 nights later, the Vipers made their move. They had been released on bail, likely funded by their shadowy connections in nearby cities, and they wasted no time regrouping. This time they came in force, not just with bats and chains, but with Molotov cocktails, gasoline cans, and a grim determination to raze Clarence's farm to the ground. Axel led the charge, his face still bearing the bruise Clarence's shotgun had given him. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was about sending a message. No one, not even an old war hero, defied the Steel Vipers. Clarence had expected them. Bullies always came back, and the smarter ones came back meaner. After the sheriff left that night, Clarence didn't sleep. He spent the next 2 days preparing his farm like it was a battlefield. He fortified the house, boarded the windows, and double-checked the traps he'd set. He didn't just plan to defend his home, he planned to make the Vipers regret ever setting foot on his property. The barn became his command post. Inside, Clarence spread out an old map of the property, marking key areas, choke points, blind spots, and paths he could use to outmaneuver the gang. He armed himself with more than his shotgun and pistol, a hunting rifle, a handful of homemade smoke bombs, and a few surprises he'd rigged from farm tools were ready to be deployed. As night fell, the farm was quiet again, but Clarence could feel the storm brewing. His resolve was ironclad. He wasn't going to run, and he wasn't going to lose. Around midnight, the rumble of engines shattered the stillness. Clarence was ready. He watched from the shadows of his barn as the motorcycles approached. There were at least a dozen of them this time, their headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. They stopped at the edge of the property, their engines idling as Axel dismounted. "All right, boys," Axel said, his voice carrying across the field. "Tonight we finish this. Burn it all. I want him crawling out of the ashes." The gang cheered, their laughter dark and full of malice. Axel lit a cigarette, tossing the match onto the ground. "Let's go," The first Molotov arced through the air, smashing against the side of the house and bursting into flames. The gang whooped and hollered as the fire began to spread, but their celebration was short-lived. From the barn, Clarence took aim with his rifle. The first shot rang out, shattering the glass bottle in one gang member's hand before he could throw it. The flaming liquid spilled onto the ground, igniting in a brilliant burst that forced the man to leap back. The gang scattered, shouting in confusion. "He's shooting at us," one of them yelled. Clarence fired again, this time striking the gas can on one of the bikes. The explosion lit up the night, sending flames and shrapnel into the air. The gang panicked, some diving for cover while others scrambled to extinguish the flames. Axel roared with anger. "Spread out! Get him!" The Vipers fanned out, but Clarence was always one step ahead. He used the traps he'd set to slow them down and sow chaos. One gang member tripped a wire stretched across the field, triggering a cascade of heavy wooden beams that toppled from the barn loft, pinning him to the ground. Another stumbled into a patch of hay soaked in motor oil, which Clarence set alight with a single well-placed shot. The chaos was total. Smoke filled the air, and the gang's cohesion crumbled as fear set in. They were used to being the predators, not the prey. Axel, furious and desperate, made his way toward the house, a Molotov in one hand and his chain in the other. "Come out, old man," he bellowed. "Face me like a man." Clarence stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun resting in his hands. The firelight danced across his weathered face, and his eyes burned with the same steel-cold determination that had carried him through Normandy. "I'm right here," Clarence said. Axel charged, swinging the chain with a wild cry. Clarence fired, the blast catching Axel's leg and sending him sprawling to the ground. The Molotov rolled from his hand unlit. He groaned in pain, clutching his thigh as he looked up at Clarence. "You don't get it, do you?" Clarence said, his voice low and measured. "You don't scare me. Men like you never did." Axel tried to scramble to his feet, but Clarence raised the shotgun again, his aim steady. "Stay down," he commanded. The wail of sirens pierced the night once again, drawing closer. The Vipers, now scattered and broken, fled into the darkness, leaving their leader behind. Clarence stood on the porch, his silhouette framed by the glow of the smoldering fire. He didn't lower his weapon until the sheriff's car pulled into the driveway. Deputies swarmed the scene, apprehending Axel and putting out the remaining fires. The sheriff approached Clarence, his expression equal parts relief and disbelief. "You all right, Clarence?" Clarence nodded, his grip on the shotgun finally relaxing. "I told you they'd be back." The sheriff shook his head. "You could have been killed." Clarence's lips curled into a faint smile. "I've been through worse." As the deputies led Axel away, the gang leader turned to Clarence, his face twisted in rage. "This ain't over, old man. You hear me?" Clarence stepped closer, his eyes like ice. "It's over when I say it's over." The sheriff placed a reassuring hand on Clarence's shoulder. "We'll clean up the rest. You've done enough." Clarence nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon as dawn began to break. The farm was scarred, but it still stood. Just like him, the faint light of dawn stretched across the sky as the last embers of the night's chaos smoldered in Clarence's fields. Smoke lingered in the air, carrying the acrid scent of burned hay and scorched wood. The steel Vipers were gone, their leader Axel handcuffed and slumped in the back seat of a sheriff's cruiser, glaring daggers at Clarence through the cracked window. Clarence stood on his porch, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the long night. His shotgun rested in his hands, the barrel still warm. The sheriff, a middle-aged man with a weary face and tired eyes, approached slowly. Behind him, deputies moved across the farm, collecting evidence and rounding up the stragglers who hadn't escaped. "Clarence," the sheriff said, his voice low and heavy. "We've got them. Axel and a few others are in custody. The rest won't get far." Clarence nodded, his face unreadable. His eyes, sharp and cold, remained fixed on the horizon where the motorcycles had fled. "They'll be back," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not this time," the sheriff replied. "We've got enough to bury them in charges. Arson, assault, destruction of property. It'll stick. And Axel? He's looking at serious time. Clarence's gaze flicked to the patrol car where Axel sat, his lip curled in defiance. Men like him don't stay down for long, Clarence said. But if he comes back, I'll be ready. The sheriff sighed. You shouldn't have to be, Clarence. You shouldn't have fought them alone. We'd let this town down. Let you down. You weren't here, Clarence said bluntly, his tone carrying no malice, just the weight of a man who had always relied on himself. So I did what I had to. The deputies worked quickly to extinguish the remaining fires and assess the damage. Clarence's house was singed but still standing. The barn had suffered worse. A section of the roof had collapsed, and the walls were blackened from the flames. The fields were pocked with scorched patches where the gang had tried to spread their destruction. Despite the wreckage, the farm still felt like a place of triumph. Clarence, battered but unbroken, stood as proof of that. Neighbors began to arrive as word spread through the small town. They brought tools, supplies, and offers of help. Some came with pies and casseroles, others with hammers and nails. One man, a younger farmer named Daniel, approached Clarence with a grim look. We all heard what happened, he said, holding out a hand. You stood up for all of us. If you hadn't stopped them here, who knows who'd be next? Clarence took the man's hand, his grip firm despite the fatigue in his arms. You don't stand up to bullies, Clarence said, and they just keep taking. The crowd murmured in agreement, and soon, the quiet determination of a community at work filled the air. The charred remains of the barn were cleared, broken windows were replaced, and the fields were tended to with care. A week later, Clarence received a call from the sheriff's office. Axel and the remaining Steel Vipers had been arraigned. The charges against them were extensive: criminal conspiracy, arson, assault with a deadly weapon, and numerous property crimes. Axel, who already had a long criminal record, faced the harshest penalties. The sheriff invited Clarence to the courthouse for the hearing. At first, Clarence hesitated. He didn't want to see Axel again, didn't want to relive the violence of that night. But as he thought about it, he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring that men like Axel didn't terrorize anyone else. On the day of the hearing, Clarence sat in the courtroom, his presence a quiet but powerful statement. When Axel was brought in, flanked by guards, his swagger was gone. The scars from that night, physical and otherwise, were evident. He shot a glare at Clarence but quickly averted his eyes when he saw the old man staring back, unflinching. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, didn't mince words. "Mr. Axel Stone," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber, "your actions were not only reckless and destructive, but a blatant disregard for the law and the safety of others. This community deserves peace, and you've done everything in your power to rob them of it." Axel tried to protest, but the judge cut him off. "Enough. I've heard all I need to. You'll serve 15 years with no possibility of parole for the first 10. The courtroom murmured in approval. Clarence remained silent, his expression unreadable. Justice had been served, but he knew the scars Axel left on this town would take longer to heal. When Clarence returned home that evening, the farm looked different. The repairs had brought a fresh energy to the place, and the community's effort had restored more than just the buildings. It had restored a sense of safety. Still, Clarence couldn't shake the feeling of vigilance that had kept him alive all these years. As the sun set over the horizon, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug steadying his hands. The field stretched out before him, peaceful once more. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and hay, and for the first time in weeks, Clarence allowed himself to relax. His pistol rested on the table beside him, as it always had, but he hoped he wouldn't need it again. For now, the farm was quiet, the town safe, and the Steel Vipers no longer a threat. He had done his part, as he always had, and he would be ready if duty called again. For now, though, he sat in the quiet, watching the stars emerge one by one, each a reminder that even in the darkest nights, light always finds a way through. The sun had long set, leaving the sky awash in deep blues and silvers. Clarence sat in his creaking rocking chair on the porch, the steady rhythm of its movement punctuating the silence of the farm. The fields stretched out before him, peaceful and serene under the moonlight. But his mind was far from quiet. He sipped his coffee, the warmth steadying his hands. Tonight wasn't like most others. The events of the past week hung heavy in the air, the echoes of roaring engines and crackling flames still fresh in his memory. The scars on his land would heal. The burned patches of grass would grow back. But Clarence knew he would carry the weight of this fight for the rest of his life, just as he had with every other battle he'd faced. His thoughts wandered back through the decades, tracing the long and winding road of his life. It had been a life of struggle, of standing firm in the face of adversity. He had fought in Normandy, trudged through the mud and chaos of war, and watched men far younger than him lose their lives for freedom. He had returned to Willow Creek hoping for peace, only to face the challenges of raising a family, keeping his farm afloat during hard times, and finally losing the love of his life, Eleanor. Yet through it all, Clarence had never wavered. Every scar, every ache in his bones was a testament to his resolve. Life wasn't about avoiding the fight. It was about facing it head-on and coming out the other side, no matter how battered you were. The Steel Vipers were just another storm in a long line of them. They had tried to take his home, his legacy, his peace. But Clarence hadn't fought for his country, his family, and his land, only to give it all up to a gang of cowards. As the farm grew quiet again, Clarence thought of the people of Willow Creek, the way they had rallied to help rebuild his barn, patch his windows, and restore the fields. It wasn't just about fixing the damage. It was about showing the Vipers and themselves that their community was stronger than fear. For years, Clarence had felt like the town had forgotten him, like his life had faded into the background as the world moved on. But now, he realized that wasn't true. His neighbors respected him, even admired him. They hadn't just rebuilt his farm. They had reminded him of the strength and unity, the same kind of strength he had once relied on in the trenches. He looked out over the fields, his gaze lingering on the silhouette of the barn. A faint smile crossed his face as he remembered a conversation with Eleanor many years ago. She had been kneeling in the garden, her hands dirty with soil, planting tomatoes. "You know what the most important thing about a garden is, Clarence?" she had asked, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "What's that?" She had smiled up at him, her eyes filled with that quiet wisdom he loved. "You plant your seeds, you tend to them, and when the storms come, you trust that they'll grow back. It's not the storms that define a garden, it's how it comes back after." That thought had stayed with him all these years, and it resonated now more than ever. The storms would always come. Sometimes they came as bullets and bombs, sometimes as grief and loss, and sometimes as roaring motorcycles and Molotov cocktails. But the storms didn't matter. What mattered was that he and the farm were still standing. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the fields in soft golds and pinks. Clarence stood, his bones creaking in protest, and leaned against the porch railing. The world felt different this morning, lighter somehow. The gang was gone, justice had been served, and the farm was alive with the promise of another day. His hand brushed the pistol still sitting on the porch table. For a moment, he considered taking it inside, putting it back in the chest where it had stayed for decades. But something stopped him. The pistol wasn't just a weapon, it was a reminder of resolve, of vigilance, of everything he had fought for. Clarence left it there, a quiet sentinel keeping watch over the land. As he turned toward the fields, he caught sight of a single crow perched on the fence post, its black feathers glinting in the morning light. It cawed once, a sound that seemed to echo across the quiet farm, before taking off into the sky. Clarence watched it disappear into the horizon, a faint smile playing on his lips. Another storm had come and gone, but Clarence Grayson was still here. The farm was still here. And as long as there was breath in his lungs, he would keep fighting for the life he'd built. The rocking chair creaked softly as he lowered himself back into it, his coffee warming his hands as the morning unfolded. The fields were quiet, the farm still. And for the first time in a long time, Clarence allowed himself to feel a deep, unshakable peace.